So for my readings for my PhD, I come across some stuff that I really you come across a lot of different stuff. You come across stuff that like, oh, that was useless. You come across stuff that like, oh, that's interesting. But I think one of the more rewarding aspects of this PhD is come across stuff you're like, oh my God, that's fascinating. And I've come across something like that. So I talk about this book a little bit that talks about fear, because one of the things that's really come up a lot in my research is just the concept of fear and how we're sort of and just fear. Like, so in collaboration, it's like people's fear of like not being rewarded. Like they'll do a lot of work and then they won't be rewarded for their work, or a lot of fear of someone will take the credit for them, or the fear that the collaboration in the project it'll fail. Like the project will fail, or they'll look bad. So it's a lot of fear that actually destroys collaboration, or make sure that collaboration doesn't happen in the first place. So there's a couple. So I've noticed that in my readings, that seems to be the thing coming up. It's either fear or shame, as Brene Brown would kind of identify. But there's this one book that's talking about fear, and I'll tell you the name of the book. I have it up on my computer so I can actually tell you the stuff and read a couple quotes from it so we can talk about it. It's called A Philosophy of Fear. It's called A Philosophy of Fear by Svendsen, Svendscen. Um, so so I'm going to read a couple quotes from here because I thought this stuff was really fascinating to me, especially in my research, and then maybe we could discuss stuff and kind of stuff like that. So the first quote I'm going to say is, the problem is that we seem to see everything from perspective of fear. And the very first metaphor he talks about is that 2006, there was an attempted terrorist attack on London that had to deal with liquids. And it was thwarted. Didn't happen. They caught it in time, all that kind of stuff, but they were going to use liquids to explode a plane in London 2006. And ever since then, almost around the world, you're only allowed to take a certain measurement of liquids on a plane with you. And this was in 2006. So that's what, 14 years ago. It was one, and it wasn't even a successful attempt at terrorism. Now, when I'm saying this, I don't want you to think that like I'm against like the security measures at the airport. That's not what I'm trying to say. What I think the point that he's making, which I think is a very interesting point, is that there was one incident that almost happened. It did not happen, and it affected the world. There's one incident, and it affected the world. A thwarted terrorist attack, and the way that it was thwarted was not by refusing liquids on the plane. It was just counterintelligence, right? So instead of increasing counterintelligence or increasing, they have this security measure on planes that now around the world, I don't think it's around the world, honestly, but in almost every airport, you're required to only have a certain amount of liquids on the plane, and it's affected us for 14 years, right? There's also that one, I don't remember the details. He didn't mention this, but I'm recalling this as I'm speaking, where the guy tried to light his shoes on fire, and the explosives were in his shoes, and so now you have to take off your shoes so they can go to the scanner, all that kind of stuff. And it seems like, and so his point is that we see a lot of the world through the fear of what might happen, the anxiety that what might happen. And a quote that I use all the time that actually leans into this perspective um, is prepare for the best, plan for the worst. Like you want to be successful, you want to have that positivity, be optimistic, but have some fail safes in place. And so like I say that when I talk about producing events, and you want to have like the phone number for the hospital, you want to have some bandages and aspirin on hand, you want to have like, access to emergency exits and all that kind of stuff. But that's not the focus of the night. The night's to have fun and laugh and all that kind of stuff. But as a producer, as a leader, you have all these other responsibilities on you have to be careful about. So that's that's one of the quotes. The problem is so I'm going to go through. I've a ton of quotes. I'm not even finished with the book yet. But it's so inspiring. It's so not inspiring. It's very provoking, evocative. Here's another thing that is very interesting that he analyzes in the book. And here's the quote: "Fear has become a theme in architecture, where an important element of the function of a building is to protect inhabitants and users against something threatening out there, so to speak." And the threat. Now he speaks about fear. I started off with an example about terrorism, and I think automatically that puts you in the mindset of always talking about terrorists or the threat being people. But he's talking about fear in general. So like the fear could be bugs or whatever it is, right? Because he's talking about just the philosophy of fear. And so that's what he's talking about. Architecture sometimes bends on your philosophy of like, well, this makes you feel safer, more comfortable, or you don't have to worry about those sort of things that you're afraid of outside, or you're afraid of happening like in 10 years where you have to restructure the building with earthquake supplements or whatever it is. So I thought that was really interesting that it's become a theme in architecture. Here's another one. I'm telling you, I have a ton, so I'll just read one more. Yeah, go for it.
And how like things are designed for that so that you feel safety and like you're playing into your can't create that form of safety for someone, right?
Yes, you're talking about like in politics and stuff.
Well, no, no. Like you're saying that architecture is designed to keep you afraid of outside the
Yes.
safety inside.
Yes.
But then at the same time, like you have the airlines where, yeah, they're not actually doing the measure. They might not actually be doing the measures that are actually making you more safe. They're doing the measures that make you think that you're being more safe.
Okay.
So in a way, they're playing into Maslow's hierarchy of needs because your basic need is the feeling of safety. So I think it's easy to control people with fear, knowing that you can then supply them safety.
So in case you can't hear, because sometimes the microphone's a little wonky in my laptop, my wife was saying that you are supplying people with the thought of protecting them from fear, so therefore you give them the sensation of safety. I worked for years in public safety, and I used to say that like public safety is not like a commodity. It's not like a little thing that I can give you. It's a sense. It's a sense of safety, and therefore it's subjective. You will feel safer with these different attributes, or you will feel less safe without these attributes, or whatever it is. But I think that's true, and then that's why I asked my wife about like the politics, is that a lot of politicians will use fear. I mean, we're all aware of this, especially now, the news outlets. I mean, there's a huge part of like about news, how politics in the news outlets are like a cycle that feed into each other in this book about how politicians use it to control people. Watch out for these people, watch out for this financial threat, watch out for this economic disaster, and only I can save you if you vote for me. But then also newspapers sell more papers because people are more likely to buy or read an article if it's something that they feel will make them safer. In essence, they're actually just buying anxiety. So if the politician's using that sort of rhetoric to control people and the newspaper is going to buy into it, then you just have this huge culture of fear. That's what the book's kind of about. That's what I'm talking about, like the fetishism of fear. Um, so here's another one, and then this is another, like it started. I'm in this phase in the book that I love. I think it's great because I think one thing that we can all identify with is that emotions are cultural, meaning our reaction to certain things are cultural. So like I think the most like broad example is in some cultures like a funeral service is supposed to be sad and quiet and maybe some music. In other cultures it's drinking and laughing and celebrating the life of someone. And culture doesn't have to be country, region, or ethnicity. It can be like subcultures too, you know. So that is like that's culturally based, and so emotions or emotional reactions can be culturally based. And so here's the quote. It's just the first part of the sentence didn't really apply to what my studies are. So all I have is we will end up with the perception of fear that to a great extent can be described as a culturally conditioned habit. Now, one of the reasons I think this is very interesting is that fear is actually a culturally conditioned habit. Is we are almost taught to be anxious about certain situations. We are almost taught to be fearful of certain situations. Not only do we have our own personal experience, like once we're bitten by a spider, if we see that spider again, we're taught by the world, or we're conditioned to be afraid of that type of spider or things that look similar. But we'll be told stories by our parents. Watch out for the spider that comes at night and blah blah. Even if we've never experienced the spider, we'll still be trained to be fearful of it, and therefore it's like culturally conditioned. But another thing that makes this interesting in relationship to my studies is Keith Johnstone said in his book Impro that sanity is a learned habit, which I think is fascinating when you think about it. So what it also is saying, if you flip that on its end, you're saying that insanity are people that haven't learned the cultural norms, basically. And so I worked in public safety. I worked with a lot of like mentally unstable people, emotionally unstable people, because I worked in Los Angeles, and so we Americans unfortunately do not handle their mentally unstable or emotionally vulnerable people very well, and just put them on the streets and expect them to fend for themselves. And so you have a high percentage of the homeless people are people that just can't emotionally take care of themselves, and that's where you get that harmful stereotype that all homeless people are crazy. And it's not true, but there is a high percentage of them that are, because they cannot take care of themselves. They cannot hold down a job. They cannot pay rent regularly. Blah 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 blah. Okay, so I had an experience where I was driving in a car and I pulled up to a stoplight. Very young woman. Was talking to herself. Her feet were dirty. Her jeans were ripped all the way up to the calf. So I would assume homeless, and talking to herself and like having a huge argument with herself. And then she came to the stoplight and she pushed the button to cross the street. And I thought that this still sticks on my mind. I totally remember the image of all this, because to me, it's like, this is why I find working with people that are irrational a little fascinating. Is that like, where was that boundary in her mind of, um, I it's okay for me to argue with myself and to not have these healthy habits, but I better push that button across the street because that's what everyone does. Like, at what level does her mind realize that here are the cultural norms, and then does not recognize what the cultural norms are? So when Keith Johnstone says that, he says, sanity is a learned habit. We basically learn, and that's okay. Oh gosh, I'm going off a huge tangent, but I think that's what a lot of it is that, like, that's why a lot of us have social anxieties, is because we're afraid that we won't relay the correct support, the correct move, the correct emotion, the correct blah 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 blah. And then, and people that are irrational and not in touch with reality have not learned that or cannot retain those habits. So I think that it's interesting to look at fear as a conditioned habit, and then also with Keith Johnstone's idea that sanity is a conditioned habit. It's I think there's a lot of merit in that. I think there's something really interesting to that, because what happens is, I don't have this quote of the book of accessible because I don't think it really relates to what my studies are. But I do think it's interesting. It identifies that what happens is when you work a certain part of your brain. So like your brain creates, okay, so one of the ways your brain identifies patterns or identifies or predicts stuff, or how you learn stuff, like if you're learning a new instrument or art form, is you do it once and it's really fumbly, and you have to be very aware of it. You have to be very cognitive of the things your hands are doing and the product that's happening. But as you do it more and more, it starts becoming second nature, like playing the guitar. And then you don't have to worry about where your fingers are supposed to be to make the note. It just automatically goes there, right? That's true with like learning any art form, sport, blah, blah, blah. The first few years, honestly, you're doing it, you're thinking very cerebrally about what the moves are supposed to be and what you're supposed to do next. But you're hoping it becomes so second nature to you that you can think more dynamically, and the technique isn't what's holding you back. It's more so just the expression. Oh gosh. So he says, so my point was how we develop patterns and how we learn stuff. So what happens is, one of the reasons it becomes more second nature is because we learn because our brain has neurons, and neurons kind of look like little octopi, like octopi with some tentacles and then like another, like a tail, right? So that tail goes back to another octopi, that then it's a bunch of tentacles to another octopi. So our brain's like just this huge network of like neurons. And when we learn something new, a new connections forms. And instead of like taking 7 neurons to make that connection in our brain, it'll create a new form that's a shortcut that only takes 3 neurons this time, right? So that's kind of, I mean, I'm giving you like the bare bones basic theory. So when we're dealing with like fear, the same thing happens, but not only the same thing happens, but because our brain's an organ, like if you work the heart, it's going to be stronger. I think it's called the amygdala. The amygdala becomes stronger, and then the neurons it becomes more of a shortcut. So you're actually um, creating a freeway for fear in your mind. And what this does is, when you do this enough times and you develop this part of your brain so much, then you've created anxiety. And that's where a lot of anxiety comes from, is because you're fine-tuned to look for that fear, to look for that shame, to look for that even when it doesn't exist. So you've created like daily anxiety. So this kind of stuff, I thought this book, I'm not even finished with it yet. I love it. I think it's great. It's very academic. It's a lot of quotes and stuff. So it's not kind of like a casual read. If you want a good casual read, Brene Brown's Daring Greatly. That's a great casual read, and and it's similar. In fact, this one attacks fear and that one attacks shame. There's a lot of similarities there, right? It's all about like, I don't want to experience shame, and I don't want to experience fear. So why do we do that? And what's the evolutionary trait there? And how can we become better from knowing this kind of stuff? So what we do is we sort of fetishize evil. We fetishize fears. What happens is we take stuff that we're afraid of. I mean, horror movies are classic examples of this, right? But I want to take something a little bit more generic, because I was talking to my wife about this. Is what inspired me. Um, so Darth Vader has a bunch of. He's mechanical. He's emotionless. He's powerful. Part of the Empire, picking on people that are just trying to do good in the world. Like, basically, he tries to kill all the Jedi, so he's in genocide. Like, he's intolerant. All these kind of things in the world that we fear, that we don't want someone in power who's intolerant and wields so much power, both with the Force, but also systematically with the government of the Empire. So we fear that. So what we do is we make a story about that, and then we fetishize the fear. Um, so I just think that concept of fetishizing fear is so interesting, because with some people it also becomes their identity. Like, I'm an anxious person, okay? Or or they become like, I don't do that because I'm afraid of this, or I don't do that because I'm afraid of this. So yeah, it's really interesting, because in my studies I found out like that is one of the major fear itself is one of the major roadblocks to collaboration, or one of the major challenges once collaboration is started, or it's one of the major roadblocks. It's one of the major roadblocks that once collaboration is started, that kind of stops it or halts it or makes it really muddy, or it even stops the collaboration from beginning in the first place. Is people's fear that it won't be good or all kind of stuff. And then a lot of that, if you think about like what I said about how we exercise these muscles in our brain to be afraid of stuff. So if you've done a lot of group projects and a lot of them fail when you're younger, when you get older and your improv team asks you to like, let's do some ensemble work, you're going to be less likely to do that. But I also think this is kind of what I'm formulating in my head as I'm reading the book, like not right now, but this is going to be a little unclear, but this is what I'm thinking, is that one of the reasons that people like improv so much, even if they're not performers, is it because it's telling people it's okay to work in groups. It's telling people will support you. Look at that. That does happen in the world. People will support you. People will applaud your effort. So I think that it's making people feel safe in with regards to like socializing, with regards to senses of community. And I think that's emotionally one of the payoffs. That's why you get a lot of improv schools or workshops that aren't really teaching technique. There's a lot of teachers out there. Okay, hello, I'm gonna lay it out straight to you. There's a lot of improv teachers out there that aren't teaching any technique or even bad technique. They're even harmful to your improv, but they're popular and they're making money because they're giving people an emotional sense of woohoo. So people keep on taking that class for that woohoo, and as opposed to actually trying to learn the art form of improv. I think that's one of the draws to improv. Like I said, I'm still formulating that in my head, but I'm loving this book so far. Cool. If you have any comments, I am so open to YouTube. So if you want me to follow you, just drop me a note on a little comment in here, and I'll comment back, and I'll like your videos, and I'll subscribe to you too. If you want to share these are great. But I'll talk to you later. Hope you're doing well. Bye.